Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 6 Degrees of Associations. We are excited to have a board member referral today, actually. Patrick King, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Lucas, good to see you as always.
Likewise, Aaron. Looking forward to this.
Yep, you guys, I think, are both up in the DC area, if I remember correctly. So whether
you left us, otherwise we could have done this live.
Yeah, I know, right? We'll talk about that. But weather-wise, are we all sweating bullets? Is the humidity just starting to drip off our face here? How's this going?
You know it well after living here for a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of rough some days already.
Yeah. Well, I'm down here in the deep south, so trust me, humidity has taken on a whole new meaning. So, Patrick, thank you for being here with Imagine, which is a digital marketing agency, if I'm saying that correctly. But I actually want to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about what Imagine does and your role there, and then we can jump into some questions.
Sure. So thanks again for having me. Imagine is a brand strategy and creative and digital marketing agency. All that put together, all that really means is we work with clients from research, identifying and amplifying their brand, and then execution. And execution looks different for every client that we deal with. You know, some may lean more towards events, some may lean more towards, donations. But it all starts with research. And I'm the founder. I started this back in 2004.
Good run.
It's been a great ride.
Yeah, that's a good thought. And so many iterations of, I mean, if we think back to 2004, everybody who's watching, in case you're younger than the average bear, the iPhone did not exist in 2004. That was still 3 years behind. I think we were just onto the Palm Pilot when 2004 rolled around. So many different changes in technology, in how brands are even looking at marketing these days. I actually like to think of marketing, and I'd love to sort of kick off the conversation this way, because we had a great sort of roll conversation around marketing and the role of marketing, and especially in associations and nonprofits who typically may not either have anyone even on board for marketing internally, or have one or two people maybe and are relying on organizations like yourself to help. Marketing has changed. When we all went to school, I think I can speak for our age group here, marketing was the 4 Ps, and now it's the 7 Ps, and there's so many other things that are involved in it that sometimes people can really start to separate and not understand that those first 4 Ps were really foundational in understanding the strategy of a company, versus just the last 3 Ps, which are mostly around promotion. The first, one of the first 4 Ps. So I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit about, how you've seen your role with associations in marketing change over the years, and where you see their strength of bringing an organization like yours to help associations really live through their brand through various activities.
Well, I think that 2004, I mean, we had, what was social media? It was like Friendster and MySpace.
Right.
I think that traditionally, the association and nonprofit space has been slower to adopt newer platforms, and it's to no fault of their own. A lot of associations and nonprofits they're short-staffed, and there can be a steep learning curve with a lot of these things. But I think that over the last 14 months, the nonprofit space has gotten a crash course in digital transformation.
Sure.
I know that for the nonprofits that I'm on the boards of, we'd have annual fundraisers, award ceremonies, and they had to transition to virtual really quick and learn a lot about what it takes to do this. And it's not just Zoom. There's a lot of other pieces that go into that. And so how are they going to connect with donors? How are they going to connect with members in a way that's beyond Zoom? Because we're all exhausted by it, right? We were exhausted by it last summer. And so it's really forced them to rethink how they connect.
Yeah.
So we've started something, right? We've kicked something off, some ingenuity, some innovation, entrepreneurship type of model with these associations. If you could wave the magic wand, or ask them to imagine, no pun intended, the next step of digital transformation for associations, what's the next step?
I think it's automation, and it's not, automation really, it does the work of 3 to 4 of you. And I think what makes automation a little slower to adopt is that there is that learning curve.
Hmm.
But you can use, in many cases, some of the tools that you already have, like MailChimp, to automate your emails. And if you have stuff like evergreen content, whether it's success stories or whatever, then go ahead and repurpose it, because the people that are signing up, or the people that you're connecting with that are getting engaged, didn't see what you posted 6 months ago. And if it's evergreen content, then anytime somebody decides to sign up on the website, or they attend a virtual event or whatever, and they go into your audience, then they're treated as if you're dealing with them in a personalized way, and it doesn't take any further work on your part.
Right.
And so I think automating as much as possible within the entire brand experience, that I think is a really missed opportunity for a lot of nonprofits.
I think you just also really hit on something truly interesting that I hadn't thought about until you said this. And actually, we just had a conversation with Jim Parker of Digitel in the sense of evergreen content. Because I do agree with you that right now, especially in the marketing world, everyone believes the aperture for exposure is so small. And because the aperture, it's almost like because it is so small, our memory doesn't remember that we saw that content a year ago. And so if it's still relevant, or even if it's content we put out a year ago and there's been an update, that content can still be brought forward in a way in which to say what the update is. And to your point, automation, having the strategy behind it and then setting it to go. And I would imagine, how often are you finding that to be one of the biggest hiccups, is learning the technology behind it, but also taking the time to strategically then map it out so that once you hit go, the automation can take care of itself. Because I think people think of automation as like a weekly task, but if you can set a right strategy, it should be doing the work for you much longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take the time to do the strategy. You have to take the time to develop your calendar and figure out what you're going to do when and how and where are the resources and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those hiccups for people?
Those really are the main two areas. One is the learning curve and the understanding of how it can benefit. I think that, and then really it's taking the time to do it. But it's just as easy nowadays with technology and platforms to automate as it is to do what you're already doing. I remember when we first started dabbling in automation, I think it was the beginning of HubSpot days. I think you're familiar with that. It was clunky. I mean, we saw the benefits, but it was still clunky.
Sure. So I would love to also ask about when you're going in and working with an association. Again, we're talking about a lot of times lean organizations who maybe don't have a ton of people in any one department, but we think about it typically membership, which AKA sales. We think about maybe they have enough people in their organization to have an educational or professional development certification sort of lead. And then maybe we think about a membership director, or that was sales. Maybe we have someone in admin, finance, and then we for sure always have a team for an annual event, or at least one person who's responsible for like their main non-dues revenue charger.
Yeah.
Where do you find the biggest collaboration could really benefit for these departments to actually work with marketing, whether it be an internal resource for marketing or an organization like yourself?
I think the biggest help that an agency or an internal resource can provide is untangling the knots, identifying personas, clarifying what those personas are, and then only then can you really speak in a way that seems personal and seems direct.
Sure.
And that's really at the core of that's the result of the research that you're doing, the brand that you're developing or redeveloping in some cases. It all has to work, it all has to mesh with who your audiences are. And the more you know those audiences, the better the marketing is going to be. There
Sure.
really is no way to market well without doing that fundamental research at the beginning.
Yeah. Can you give us an example, Patrick? I'm sure you've worked with a ton of different industries, but where you can sort of take that strategy implementation that Imagine's done, or maybe even some of the automation, because in both those cases, in our experience, the return far outweighs the investment. But do you have sort of a practical example of where you can implement some of that and where associations seen those type of returns?
Sure. So some example personas, we'll start with like 4. Okay. So you'll have group memberships, you'll have single memberships, you'll have large donors, you'll have micro donors. And with just those 4, you can expand that, to a dizzying degree. But once you identify who those personas are, then you create content that speaks to them in as much of an individual way as possible. And then with that backlog of content, now you can automate the content that they receive and speak more directly to them.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people, again, I go back to, because my experience has been in marketing, so we're sort of leaving Lucas out of the conversation for a second here, but not that he does. He knows his stuff. He just is being humble. But we were talking earlier about how marketing over the years has changed, and a lot of times, again, because marketing is a department, it ends up being looked at as a silo, like any other department in any organization. And for better or for worse, I would say, I'm just going to be guessing. I have no scientific evidence to say this, but let's say 65% of organizations just worldwide are siloed, right? It's just human nature to go, I'm in this area. My responsibility is this. My responsibility is IT. My responsibility is sales. My responsibility is finance. And yet, marketing to me has always been one of the ones that it doesn't need to fight for airtime for its own sake, but for the sake of all of the different parts being oiled and working well together. It always benefits the organization and behooves the organization to include marketing in any of those discussions. And I'm interested to know, like, if you've worked with an organization where, you've uncovered through a different department that, hey guys, we developed these couple of personas and we're working on some marketing for you guys, but we're hearing over here that, like, government affairs is a really big issue for you all, and it's a really big thing for your organization. And yet we've developed no marketing to market to government officials. And yet you need to be reaching them because that's how you tell your members you're successful. I'm just curious if you've been in that kind of situation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We have situations like that all the time where maybe there's a hidden or untapped strength that it's just been overlooked. Or that there is a very active audience that wants to be spoken to. It's clearly engaged on their own, but there hasn't been like a strategic pursuit.
Sure.
So that happens.
But it's really hard because if you're brought in, even just by, if an association doesn't have a marketing person, but they have a person who's responsible for their annual event, or vice versa, maybe it's the marketing person that's responsible for that person, if they're not engaged across the organization, they might not know that the left hand is over running a really strong government affairs department. And that audience is completely left out of the discussion because we're focused on logo, membership, event.
Yes.
So how are you seeing the future for the intersection of where technology comes in to how marketing has been working in the past?
There are tons of platforms out there now. There are platforms to do pretty much anything that you'd want to do virtually. And I think that from the last 14 months, there have been 2 types of associations. There have been the ones that saw the benefit of going virtual. They adapted and to some degree, virtual is going to be a part of their, their strategy moving forward.
Sure.
And then there are the nonprofits that couldn't make it quite work, or
Sure.
it's a stressful experience. And they'll be the ones that are just going to run right back to, let's get back to 2019. And so I think there's going to be a divergence there. But what we do is try to make sure that the association or nonprofit is leveraging technology as much as possible.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm going to throw you a kind of a curveball, Patrick. And I say curveball because we didn't talk about this in sort of the pre-call. But have you started to take us in a little bit different directions? Have you started to have conversations, or maybe you've always been having these conversations with associations around recruitment, but in the sense of diversity and inclusion? Meaning, we had a conversation weeks ago around diversity and inclusions within associations, meaning it may be industry specific, but we're not strategizing well enough around diversifying within a particular vertical industry, and how that strategy could play out from a marketing perspective.
Well, so I'm currently the president of the American Marketing Association's DC chapter, and the American Marketing Association has really stepped up, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've set up, their own committees, encouraging chapters to develop their own DEI platforms. Mm-hmm. And we've had a few community forums virtually over the past year where we get to learn from members get to learn from us, and we use diversity, equity, and inclusion as, it's not a committee necessarily in the traditional sense. It's not like a think tank. It's an engine. It's a motor for the entire organization, and it helps move us forward. It makes sure that our membership materials, our website, everything really mirrors our membership. It mirrors our community.
Yeah.
And that's something that just over the past couple of years has been, that's something that I think all nonprofits, they could all benefit from, that type of DEI, engine.
Yeah, for sure. I think just to start to wrap up the conversation, because I think this last question that Lucas will ask actually will unravel a longer response than we normally have to it. So maybe, Lucas, we can dive into the where do we work section of this, because I think for a creative agency, we're going to have a little bit of a different answer. And I'd love to dig into that just a bit.
Yeah, so the where we work, we've been starting to introduce at the end of our pod here to try to give people an opportunity to share, no wrong answer, because we've heard everything across the board at this point. Post-pandemic, it's changed a lot of things, especially the office space. So imagine, where are you guys, and can tell us a little bit about, are you home, in the office? Is it a hybrid? And maybe a little bit about why.
We're definitely a hybrid. There are people that come into work every day. There are people that solely work remotely. And then there are people in the middle that come in a couple days a week. Yeah. And most of that's fine. We can manage projects from wherever. We can do team huddles from wherever, but it's what we miss by doing it 100% virtually is the level of creativity that comes from people being in the same room, kind of breathing the same air. Yeah. It's just a completely different experience that even after this long, I haven't been able to replicate, virtually. And so that's why we can't go 100% remote. It would not make sense for the way that, at least that I and my team collaborate and brainstorm and bounce ideas around the room.
Yeah, the reason I was intrigued by that, and I was anticipating that to be the answer, is because we are talking so much about digital forward, virtual decisions for organizations. But I do think, and we haven't had someone sort of speak about it in that way, in the way in which you just talked about it yet, mainly because maybe they're not creative agencies, so they're not creatively thinking about what they're missing, right? Because a lot of us aren't, not many areas sit in brainstorming and things like that, but when you're coming up with the campaigns and strategies, we're used to it, especially in the marketing world. You're very used to having big strategy sessions, whiteboards everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think it's something to dig into about the fact that there is a sense of creativity you might lose, and that would translate to associations, trade groups that also need to get some things done, and this need for hybrid, and sometimes even all in person. That you need to use your digital tools to figure out how to get that translated out to others, but for the meat of it, it needs to be in person or something. So I was just curious how, if you aren't able to have everyone in one place, if you're brainstorming, or even if you are, how are you all then sort of carrying that through in the virtual world? Because you probably aren't returning back to being together the next day, but you might call a meeting of a group together for 2 days to brainstorm. Is that been a difficult transition?
Kind of.
Yeah.
When we're in person, that's where a lot of the real discovery comes into play, where we find out, all right, so what's at the core, what's the big idea of this campaign? How are we going to make it different? And that's where we challenge ourselves. And then from there, then we start worrying about the details.
Sure.
What are the channels? What's the schedule? That kind of stuff. And then, of course, that can be managed,
Right.
virtually. But it's that, what's the big idea? Those I can't, not on here.
Doesn't happen here. I agree.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and think about all the years, and I think that's the nut to crack for everybody, because even think about the annual conference. Part of what digital has allowed us to do is to have the annual conference live on, because it did used to be a big brain dump, big handshaking, back patting, a party for a couple of days. You got back together with everyone, and how many of us have attended something like that, and then a week later we're back to the grind? We're not, we're not thinking inspirationally anymore. We're not, we've emailed all the contacts we needed to contact, after the thing. And so I think that companies, you're sort of bringing up a good point of like, how do you do that? And then how do we use all the digital tools that we might use externally to actually motivate and keep the conversations going internally? Because we're now all moving to a situation that might look a lot more like that annual event. Yeah. And then the day-to-day grind. So I appreciate that perspective of yours.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap this up. I want to be respectful of your time. As everyone knows who's watched this before, we always like to bring in the cane and say, all right, we got to go, but we want one more thing from you. Who do you think we should be speaking to in the association world that our audience could benefit hearing from?
One person that would be wonderful to talk to, her name is Angela Long. Okay. She's the immediate past president of the AMA chapter.
Oh, great.
Okay. And she's also the one of the main people that heads up DEI.
Oh, great.
And how it's implemented and rolled out with our chapter.
Oh, great.
And so I think she'd be a big help.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Great. Angela, we can't wait to meet you.
Yeah.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much. I think we could have probably gone on for a while, because Lord knows I wanted to get into the details and the nitty gritty and reminisce and talk and, air out all of our angst around how marketing is perceived in the world. But we really appreciate you parting with some of these interesting facts. And where can people find you if they wanted to see more about Imagine?
Our website is imaginedc.net, and our social media handles are We Fight Ugly, pretty much everywhere. Our tagline is Doctors Fight Disease, Lawyers Fight Injustice, We Fight Ugly.
Wow. Okay. I like it.
Yeah. That's perfect.
Awesome. That's cool. That's
Thank
imaginary.
you, Patrick. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.